let me start right away without any further ado. My name is Thomas. I am 40 years old and a trucker with 20 years of experience. I've seen hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads, the dust of dozens of countries, and thousands of hours spent alone in the truck cab. And you know, I always thought that the road was my life, that it would take away everything from me, even the time for real happiness. But one day I met her, Amelia. Oh, Amelia. You know, there are some people who immediately grab your heart and squeeze it as if they will never let go. She was 25, and I was, by all accounts, already a bit of a worn-out wolf. But what can you do when love comes so suddenly and strikes like lightning on a metal roof? Her eyes were like the sea in the morning when the sun is just waking up, and her smile. Oh, that smile! She was like a ray of sunshine for me among the endless winter flights. I remember the day we got married. It was summer, it smelled like freshly cut grass, and it seemed that even the sky was smiling at us. I was standing in my simple suit, and she was walking toward me in a light dress that emphasized her beauty. My friends were joking, "Thomas, you've gone crazy. 15 years apart." But what did they understand? I was convinced that she was my second wind, my road that would always lead me home. The first months of our marriage were like a long honeymoon. Candlelit dinners, endless conversations until dawn, laughter, and plans for the future. I worked on flights, bringing home money, and she stayed at home, shrouded in tenderness and care. Every time I came back, it was a celebration, dinner cooked by her hands, hugs that seemed to promise peace. I felt young again, and she was my muse, my inspiration in this monotonous life of a trucker. But sooner or later, reality comes to shatter illusions. One day, on a flight to Germany, I felt this strange, oppressive weight in my heart. You know, every man has a sixth sense that wakes up when something is wrong. My phone conversations with Amelia became shorter, her voice became cooler, and her only response to my jokes was an uncertain, And I began to wonder if she was hiding something. Instead of checking right away, I tried to calm myself down. "No, it's nothing, you're Thomas, don't make it up." But the thought kept drilling into my brain, not letting me rest. When I returned home after a 3-week flight, I immediately noticed a change. Amelia greeted me not with the same lively joy as always, but as if forced, with a barely noticeable smile. The house was perfectly clean, but there was a certain artificiality in the air. In the evening, we sat at the table. I was joking around, telling her about my adventures on the road, but her eyes kept gliding past me, as if she was waiting for something or someone. And suddenly she said, almost without thinking, "Thomas, I think we need more time for each other. I feel lonely." These words pierced me like a cold wind. Men who work long distance know that a woman who talks about loneliness has something on her mind. That night I lay awake, listening to every sound in the house. Amelia was sleeping next to me, breathing evenly, and I wondered if her loneliness was just words or a signal of something worse. My mind raced with thoughts. Was I really a fool for not noticing the obvious? The day I set off on my next drive, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden light across the endless road in front of me. Highways have always been my refuge, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, where the sound of the engine helped drown out everything else. But this time, something was wrong. Amelia's words, spoken on that last night before I left, kept running through my head. "Thomas, I think we need to spend more time together. I feel lonely." I tried to convince myself that it was just a small thing, but anxiety was building in my soul, like a storm that is about to hit you unexpectedly. The road was long and winding, and every kilometer reminded me of the distance that separated me from home. Of course, the life of a trucker is not just a profession, but a real challenge. You leave your home knowing that your wife is waiting for you at home, but you have no guarantee that everything will be as you imagine it to be in your absence. My flights were always long, weeks and sometimes months. I got used to the road, to the feeling of loneliness, which sometimes turns into peace and sometimes into a burden. But now this burden seemed unbearable. The first few days of the trip were relatively calm. The work, as always, was distracting. Inspections, stops at gas stations, filling out paperwork, talking to other truckers who had become a kind of brotherhood in this endless movement. However, whenever I was alone, when the night enveloped the road and I was left with only the glare of headlights and the sound of the engine, thoughts of Amelia would not let me rest. She had become withdrawn lately. Her voice on the phone had become dry, as if she was speaking only out of obligation. Or maybe it was just my imagination. On the third day of the trip, when I stopped in the parking lot near a small cafe where drivers usually stopped, I decided to call her. She didn't answer, and I felt something tighten inside me, like a cold hand trying to squeeze my heart. Instead of the usual, "Hello, darling," I heard only long dial tones that seemed to never end. My hand was shaking as I put the phone down on the table in the cab. Later, when I checked my phone again, there was a notification. At first I thought it was a message from Amelia, and my heart leapt with hope, but no, it was Mr. Bryan, our neighbor, an elderly man who was always too attentive and inquisitive. His message was short, but it took my breath away. "Thomas, I hope you know that there was a party at your house last night. It was very loud and lasted almost until the morning." I read this several times, trying to make sure I hadn't misheard. My first reaction was automatic disbelief. Maybe it's a mistake? I thought. But why would Bryan make up something like that? He had always been honest, sometimes even too meticulous, but he had no reason to lie. I could feel the blood pulsing in my temples and my heart beating faster. A party? Until the morning? And I didn't know anything about it? Dozens of questions flooded my mind. Why didn't she tell me? Who was at this party? And most importantly, what was going on there? My fingers dialed her number, but there was no answer again. I squeezed the phone so tightly that it seemed like it was going to crack in my hands. The worst thoughts came into my head: betrayal, deception, distrust. Everything I thought was strong in our marriage suddenly shook like a house of cards in the wind. Several hours passed, and every minute seemed like an eternity. I tried to distract myself, to focus on my work, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept coming back to that party. I imagined music playing in our house, strangers laughing, and somewhere in the middle of it, my wife was standing there, smiling at someone who was not me. This image haunted me, fueling the flames inside me with every passing second. When it was getting dark, the phone finally rang. It was Amelia. Her voice sounded smooth, as if nothing had happened, even a little irritated. "Hi, Tomas, I saw that you called. Is something wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying not to explode right away. "Listen, Amelia, a neighbor texted me about some kind of party at our house." "What was it?" I asked, trying to keep my temper in check, but my voice still trembled with pent-up anger. She was silent for a few seconds, and that silence was heavier than any words. Then her voice sounded light-hearted. "Oh, it was nothing. A few friends came to visit, and we just sat for a while. I didn't want to bother you because you were on a flight." A trifle, my voice was a mixture of incredulity and anger. "Until the morning? And you didn't even think to tell me?" Amelia sighed, and I felt her calmness only fuel my anger. "Thomas, you know what it's like to be home alone when your husband is thousands of miles away. I just wanted to have some fun." These words pierced me like a cold wind. "A little fun?" I repeated, trying not to lose control. After our short phone conversation, I sat in the truck's cab like I was trapped, not knowing what to do with myself. The air was filled with bitterness and tension. My hands were still shaking, and the thoughts of what had happened seemed to be eating away at my mind. We had never really quarreled before, of course. There were minor misunderstandings, but this was completely different. This time left behind an acute feeling of rupture, as if an invisible thread had broken between us. The road, which had always been a comfort to me, became unbearable this time. I couldn't find a place to sit or stand, let alone continue working. Every minute seemed like an hour, every sound of the engine cut my ears. The same questions kept running through my head: why? Who was there? What was really happening? As night fell, the anxiety became so deep that even the sky seemed alien and hostile. My colleagues who saw me in the parking lot gave me brief glances without asking too many questions. They knew that when a man is in such a state, it is better not to pry. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. From time to time, I remembered how Amelia and I laughed while sitting in our old kitchen, how she clung to me after months of separation, and it only made the pain of our fight worse. In the evening, when I finally felt that I couldn't take the tension anymore, I decided to dial her number again. The phone rang for a long time, and each ring seemed like the last blow to my patience. But there was no answer. I sighed and put the phone down on the dashboard. It seemed as if I was losing not only control over the situation, but also over my life in general. Images of Amelia sitting at home, perhaps upset about our fight, or vice versa, having fun with someone else, not thinking about me, came to mind. My pride argued with my mind. Why call again? She doesn't want to talk. But on the other hand, I had a desire to make things right, to at least try. I dialed her again, but the answer was as silent as before. I remained sitting in the cockpit, leaning back against the seat and staring into the darkness that surrounded me on all sides. The engine hummed softly, creating the illusion of company, but it only increased the feeling of loneliness. The next day began with anxiety. I woke up early, although I had hardly slept. I had work to do in the morning, but my thoughts were far from papers and routes. I opened my phone, hoping to see a message from her, at least one word, but the screen was blank. Leaving the car in the parking lot, I went to the morning cargo check, trying to focus on my work, but it was useless. At noon, I couldn't stand it any longer and dialed her number. This time the answer did not take long. Amelia's voice was calm, even a little sleepy. "Hello, Thomas." "Amelia, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that," I began, feeling the tension in my chest ease with each word. She was silent for a few seconds and then sighed. "I didn't want us to fight either. It was just a stupid misunderstanding. I really didn't mean to offend you." As I listened to her, I felt a wave of relief flood through me from head to toe. Her words sounded sincere, and I allowed myself to believe that it was all just an accident, a moment of weakness that could be forgiven and forgotten. We talked some more, exchanging phrases about how much we missed each other, and it finally gave me strength and confidence. "Then, when I get back, let's try to spend some time together, without any distractions," I said, trying to put warmth and hope into my voice. "Yes, Tomas, that would be great," she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the one I loved so much. The conversation ended, and I felt a heavy stone slide off my soul. Perhaps it was really just a difficult period that we would go through together, and everything would fall into place. A few weeks passed after that big fight, and everything seemed to be back to normal. Amelia became affectionate again, often called me, told me about her days, joked as if nothing had happened. I began to believe that the worst was over and that we had managed to survive this crisis. However, there was a shadow of doubt in my heart that was eating away at me from the inside. One day during my next flight, when I made a stop at a truck stop in France, my phone vibrated to alert me to a new message. It was from Mr. Bryan, a neighbor who was always overly vigilant and caring. I opened the message and saw a short but disturbing text: "Thomas, this time the party at your house was even louder than the previous ones. Laughter and alcohol until the morning. I hope everything is okay." These words burned me. I reread the message several times, trying to understand if it was real. Was it all happening again? The feeling of anxiety gripped me again. I immediately dialed Amelia's number, but the phone was silent. I tried again and again, but there was no answer. My mind told me that maybe she was just sleeping, that there was no reason to panic, but my heart was beating so hard that I could hear it pounding in my temples. A few hours passed until I received a message from her: "Hi, I was busy, sleeping after a long evening with friends." This message only added fuel to my anxiety. In the evening, I called her again. This time she answered, but her voice sounded cold, as if we were strangers. "Why are you calling again, Thomas? I told you everything was fine." "Amelia, the neighbors keep complaining about your parties. What's really going on?" "We agreed that you wouldn't party so loudly while I was away," I said, trying to control my voice. She suddenly got angry, and her tone became harsh. "What do you want from me? I sit at home alone for weeks while you work and see only the road in front of you. You don't even know what it's like to live in anticipation, not knowing when your husband will return. I work like hell to make sure you have everything you need, that our house is full of everything you need. But it seems like it's not enough for you if you throw parties when I'm not there." The words came out of me almost automatically. "Do you think money solves everything, Thomas?" she shouted. "You make money, yes, but so what? I don't live, I survive. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? Do you think I'm satisfied with your business trips and checking your phone? No, Thomas, that's not enough for me. So what do you want, Amelia? More money? I'm already working my ass off to make sure we have everything." I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. I was torn by emotions. On the one hand, I understood that she felt lonely, but on the other hand, her claims only made me feel more and more injusticed. "Yes, maybe more money, Thomas," her voice became hysterical. "Do you think I don't see how other women live? All those expensive dresses, parties and restaurants, and what do I have? Only loneliness and your calls from the road." She hung up, and I was left sitting in the cab feeling like I was being torn in half. Her words about money and other women's lives echoed in my head for a long time. They mixed with the resentment and despair that had been building up for months. Did she really think that money was what solved everything? I worked harder than ever, giving up rest just to give her everything I could, and this is how it paid off. The next few days were like hell. We barely talked. Her answers to my calls were short, dry, as if she was doing her duty. She didn't talk about her days, didn't ask about mine, and it seemed like we were separated by an invisible wall that was getting thicker every day. The neighbors began to complain more and more about the parties, laughter, and loud music. Mr. Bryan even called me personally once. "Thomas, I understand that you're always on the road, but these past weeks have been too much. We respect you, but what's going on in your house makes us think you should know better." Every conversation like this ate away at me from the inside, adding even more doubt and anxiety. I worked, continued my flights, but in my heart I was growing fear and a feeling that control over my life was slipping out of my hands. It seemed that the home I had worked so hard to build was now a strange and unfamiliar place. The last few weeks were a real challenge for me. Calls from home were becoming less and less frequent, and Amelia's responses were short and distant. Our conversations were reduced to simple questions and answers, devoid of any warmth. I had the feeling that I was not talking to my wife, but to someone distant and alien. Neighbors continued to write and call me, telling me about the parties that had become regular at my house. It was tearing me apart from the inside. I worked day and night to give Amelia everything she wanted, and in return I received only reproaches and a feeling of losing control of my life. I couldn't stand by any longer. One day, when I was on a flight near our city, my patience ran out. I pulled into the parking lot and dialed Mr. Bryan's number. His voice was familiar and calm, but I could tell that he was a little surprised to hear from me. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bryan," I said, trying to hide the tension in my voice. "I have a big favor to ask of you. I don't know how else to resolve this situation, but could you keep an eye on my house if there is another party? I really need to know what's going on." He sighed, but answered with understanding, "Of course, Thomas. I know how hard this must be for you. I will keep an eye on the house and let you know." After this conversation, I could not find a place to sit. My mind was racing with thoughts of what was really going on at home. When Mr. Bryan said there would be another party, I decided not to wait another second. I wasn't that far away, just a few hours away. Gathering all my things, I got in the cab and started driving toward home, feeling the tension tighten in my chest like a steel vise. The road was gloomy and dark. Only the headlights of my truck cut through the night gloom, casting a glare on the roadside. Time was dragging on like an eternity. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and the thought of what I would see when I arrived made my heart beat faster. Doubts and fears merged into one, creating an oppressive feeling. When I reached my city, the night was in full swing. I knew I couldn't just walk into a house and start asking what was going on. I had to be careful. I parked a few blocks away so that no one would notice my truck. There was a cold autumn wind in the air, as if to say that this night would be a turning point in my life. I approached the house quietly, careful not to arouse suspicion. The lights from the windows brightly illuminated the street, and I could hear the sounds of loud music and laughter. It was not just an ordinary evening with friends. It was a real party, with drinks, laughter, and voices mingling in a chaotic chorus. It seemed that the house had become a complete stranger to me. I stopped behind the bushes growing near the fence and began to watch. My heart was pounding so hard that I was afraid I could hear it. Through the window I saw people I did not know. Guys and girls were dancing, laughing, raising their glasses as if they were celebrating some event. Among them I saw Amelia. She was standing in the center of the room, smiling, with a glass of champagne in her hand. Her eyes were sparkling with joy, and her movements were light and effortless. She looked so carefree that I even doubted my own reaction for a moment. But my doubts quickly dissipated when I noticed one of the men approaching her and putting his arm around her shoulders. Amelia didn't pull away, she just smiled and said something to him that I couldn't hear, but it seemed so natural and close that I felt cold. My hands clenched into fists, and I felt anger rising from the very bottom of my being. I stood there for a few more minutes, trying to figure out what to do next. I stood behind the bushes, breaking out in a cold sweat and watching what was happening inside my house. My heart was beating so loudly that I was afraid someone might hear it. Music was playing in the room, laughter was getting louder, and glasses were being raised one by one. The people in my house, these strange faces to me, felt as if they were in their element. My wife stood among them, cheerful and relaxed, as if it were all completely normal. I was overwhelmed by the opposite emotions. I looked at her, and a storm was building inside me. Every gesture she made, every laugh she shared with others was like a knife stabbing me. Suddenly, one of the guys, tall and smiling impudently, got up from the couch and led one of the girls in the direction of one of our bedrooms. They were laughing, their hands intertwined, and I felt a bitter lump form in my throat. There were 5 boys and 2 girls left in the room, including my Amelia. I could see them sitting in a circle, drinking and talking. Their voices, though drowned out by the music, reached me in fragments. The tone of the conversations varied, from humorous to serious, but the general meaning was obvious. They talked about life, about how boring marriages are and how hard it is to stay faithful. One of the guys exclaimed, "Who needs it? Marriage is a shackle for fools," and everyone laughed, including my wife. I stood there with my mouth open, listening to these words. The world around me suddenly seemed to grow darker, and the sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I was overcome with anger mixed with despair. I wanted to break into the house, grab a tire iron from the car and blow everything to smithereens, throw these people out, look them in the eye and ask, do they realize what they are destroying? But I restrained myself, clenching my fists tightly so that my nails dug into my palms. I realized that if I burst in now, everything would end horribly, and perhaps the worst was yet to come for me and for her. So I stayed put, like a spring, waiting for the tension to reach its peak. Amelia was sitting on the couch, and the guy next to her, the one who had just shouted out marriage, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She smiled, but did not pull away. I felt anger pulsing in my head and my vision went black. Amelia continued to dance, mesmerizing everyone with her movements. The music that was loud in the room became the backdrop for the scene that was unfolding before my eyes. One of the men got up from his seat and, coming closer, stood next to her. I saw her smile at him without showing any hint of hesitation. Her movements became even more graceful, and she began to dance for him, focusing her attention on his presence. It was a moment that made me feel as if the ground beneath my feet was disappearing. My head was full of conflicting thoughts and emotions. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it could drown out even the music. I clenched my fists, restraining myself, trying not to lose control, even though everything inside me was screaming that something unacceptable was happening. Her closeness to this man, her behavior, all of this was becoming a real test for me. Emilia took him by the hand and led him to the corner of the room. The scene I saw left no room for doubt. She was behaving in a way I could never have imagined. Her playfulness and courage were such that I felt my anger and pain building to what seemed like the breaking point. The man stood there with his eyes closed, his face reflecting a mixed sense of surprise and pleasure. Her movements were confident and professional, which only intensified my internal conflict. Finally, she stood up, took his hand again, and led him toward the bedroom. I stood there, staring out the window, while the bedroom door closed behind them. What was happening behind that door was something I had always feared, but could never have imagined becoming a reality. My wife had crossed a line I thought she would never cross. What was supposed to be our private time had become part of this reckless evening, and the thought was unbearable to me. I sat with my hands clenched tightly, feeling every sound coming from the house like needles stabbing into my mind. Their voices, laughter, muffled conversations, all of it created a loud chaos that tore me apart from the inside. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples and was breathing heavily, trying to keep myself from acting rashly. I knew that if I broke into the house now, it would end in disaster not only for them, but also for me. All that was left was to wait, watch and hope that this night would end one day. But this did not happen. Time passed, and the party gained momentum. The other guests, the ones who stayed in the living room, continued to drink, laugh, and make jokes that sometimes seemed too frank. They didn't notice anyone or anything, seemed to be separated from the rest of the world, immersed in their own little bubble of entertainment. It all looked as if there had never been any rules or restrictions in this house. My mind slowly began to refuse to accept the reality my wife was in. What was happening behind the bedroom door and the way she was behaving in front of these people didn't seem like her behavior, but someone else's. I didn't want to believe it was true, that the woman I loved and worked for night and day could be capable of such a betrayal. I wanted to find an explanation, an excuse, but every second I spent in that disturbing silence took away my last hope. I sat in the shadows, hidden from prying eyes, and every sound from the house seemed like thunder in my head. Hearing them continue to have fun was unbearable. Every laugh, every loud remark, every echo of music was like an echo of a blow to my heart. But the worst part was the feeling of helplessness. I was right there, but I couldn't do anything to change what was happening. I knew that if I acted, everything would end horribly. My imagination painted the worst possible scenarios, and they seemed more real than any fiction. I closed my eyes to try to distract myself, but the images and sounds kept coming back. I felt trapped in my own emotions, where every minute brought a new level of pain and despair. But there was no end to the party. The night went on, and the atmosphere in the house became more and more tense. I could not take my eyes off the window, despite the fact that every new moment I saw brought only pain and despair. Suddenly, 2 more men entered the bedroom where my wife and one of the guests had disappeared. Their shadows slid across the light in the room, and then the door closed quietly behind them. I felt my heart freeze and then start pounding so hard that I thought it was about to burst out of my chest. Uncertainty and imagination were tearing me apart from the inside, drawing pictures of what could be happening behind the closed door. The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me completely, and it seemed that I was in an endless nightmare from which there was no way out. Voices and laughter continued to sound in the house, and time seemed to have stopped. Every minute dragged on like an eternity, and I remained in this darkness of my doubts and fears. I couldn't break in, I couldn't stop what was happening, and this feeling of helplessness made my helplessness even more unbearable. My consciousness refused to accept what I was seeing and feeling, but the reality was relentless. Hours passed, and every new sound seemed like a knife stabbing into my heart. It seemed to me that the walls of my own home were witnessing something I could never have predicted or imagined. I continued to sit in the darkness, hiding in the shadows, and my thoughts whirled like a hurricane. Every sound that came from the house, every muffled laugh or word that came out through the music became an invisibly heavy burden for me. I could feel my faith in everything that was important shaking and breaking. Time passed, and night began to give way to morning light. The dawn was piercing its first rays through the darkness, and I saw people slowly starting to come out of the house. Their movements were slow and uncertain, their laughter had died down, and all that remained was the fatigue of the night's events. I recognized a few of the people coming out and saw them exchanging jokes and farewells as they got into their cars and went home. Amelia saw them all off. She looked different, tired, but seemed satisfied, as if the night had brought her more than just entertainment. I felt something snap inside me. It was a tacit admission that my worst fears had come true. I sat there for a long time, watching the house plunge into silence. The sun rose higher and its rays began to illuminate the street, bringing a new day that seemed to bring only emptiness and despair. I was sitting in the cab of my truck, not taking my eyes off the house where the last sounds of a party that seemed to last forever were echoing. My heart was beating so hard that I thought I could hear it even outside the truck. Every time I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, a new burst of laughter or muffled voices reminded me that this was a reality from which I could not escape. When the last guests finally began to leave the house, I saw them saying goodbye, swaying and exchanging smiles. Their shadows glided across the courtyard, and each of them seemed like a figure from my worst dreams. The last to leave was a woman who was straightening her dress and laughing as if the party had been nothing but a pleasant adventure. She raised her hand, waved goodbye to someone, and at that moment I saw the door close behind her, leaving the house in silence. Slowly, very slowly, I got out of the truck. The air was fresh and cool, but it didn't relieve the tension that was raging inside me. My legs seemed to move forward on their own, leaving the road, the cab, the safety behind. I was walking toward the house that had once been a symbol of my happiness, but now looked like a stranger. The path that I had once made with my own hands was like a chasm that I had to cross to get to the answer that would destroy me. The door opened effortlessly, creaking as if to warn me of my arrival. Inside was silence, but the smell of the night's festivities was still in the air, a mixture of perfume, alcohol, and something else I couldn't identify. The living room was in disarray, overturned chairs, empty bottles, glasses with half-drunk drinks. There were uneaten snacks on the table, and the tablecloth was wrinkled as if it had been pulled in different directions. All of this was proof that the night had been rough. I walked around the room, looking at every detail. The picture in my head was drawing itself: laughter, music, her face in the light, smiling and carefree, as if everything was normal. I felt anger growing inside me. Every step I took was heavy, as if my feet were covered with lead. I approached the bedroom door, the very room where we used to laugh, share dreams, and make plans for the future. I heard a light rustling coming from the room. Amelia, my wife, was lying on the bed, her hair scattered on the pillow, her face relaxed, her eyes closed, as if she were in a deep sleep. She looked as if there was not a single care in her life, as if the night was just part of a game that I had nothing to do with. Suddenly she stirred, and I heard her speak softly, almost through her sleep, "Have you decided to play another round?" Her voice was soft and playful, like in the days of our youth, when we were still carefree and happy. These words, which might have been innocent in another situation, were the last straw. My back tensed and my hands involuntarily clenched into fists. "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded deaf, choked with the anger that had been building up inside me all these hours. Her eyes opened sharply, and I saw surprise and then fear flicker through them. She realized who was standing in front of her, and her face lost its color. A heavy silence hung in the room, so dense that it seemed to squeeze us from all sides. Her lips were parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. I looked into her eyes, trying to find at least a hint of remorse or shame, but all I saw was a mixed feeling of fear and confusion. "You have 10 minutes, I said slowly, each word heavy as a stone falling into water. My words cut through the silence, leaving her defenseless against the inevitable. Amelia jerked out of bed as if she had been thrown. Her eyes were wide open, her expression was one of misunderstanding, and her face changed from calm to anxiety. She began to look around the room quickly, as if looking for an explanation for what was happening. Her hair was tousled and the blanket she was wrapped in fell to the floor, exposing her shoulders. She instantly covered herself with the blanket and looked at me and spoke in a whisper, but her voice was already panicked. "Thomas, what's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" I was silent, not taking my eyes off her. My anger was so intense that I could feel the blood pounding in my temples and my hands involuntarily tensed, ready for something unexpected. Her words, which once made my heart beat faster with joy, now sounded hollow and meaningless. They were an attempt to stop something that was already unstoppable. "Tomas, my love, what's wrong?" Her voice tried to sound gentle, like the times when we shared secrets and dreams. But now it only made me feel more betrayed. I kept my eyes on her, and she saw something in my eyes that made her nervously clutch the blanket even tighter. She took a step forward, but I held my hand out, gesturing for her to stop. "Don't you understand what happened?" I finally said, and there was not a note of softness in my voice. Only a cold and ruthless tone that I hadn't expected from myself. "You have 10 minutes, I added, not changing my expression. She flinched as if from a blow. Her face turned pale and tears appeared in her eyes. "Thomas, I don't understand. What do you mean? Can we talk? Let's sit down and talk it over." She tried to get closer to me, stretched out her hand, but I stepped back, leaving a distance between us that she could not cross. "Time is up," I repeated, looking at the clock on the wall. Every second echoed in my head like a hammer blow. She realized I wasn't joking. The panic on her face grew, and she began frantically searching for her things, glancing toward the door as if she wanted to escape but didn't know how. Amelia grabbed her bag off the floor, but her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't find the zipper. She looked up at me, trying to read any emotion in my face other than the soulless, cold expression that seemed to be frozen there forever. "You can't just kick me out, we're family. What are you doing?" Her voice turned into a whisper full of despair. I could feel her every word fueling my anger, but I restrained myself because I knew that if I let my emotions get the better of me, I would do something I would regret. My fists clenched and unclenched, but I didn't move. I could feel how hard it was to breathe, how every breath was a struggle. "You still don't understand what happened, Amelia?" I finally said, my words laced with bitter irony. Her eyes widened and tears streamed down her cheeks. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. I stood in front of her, feeling the anger that had been building up over the past few days and nights finally bursting out. My words sounded harsh and merciless, echoing in the silence of the room like hammer blows. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you. You're a whore." Amelia shuddered, and her eyes filled with horror. Tears streamed down her face and she began to tremble, but I didn't stop. My anger drove me to keep talking without stopping. "Your time is up, you better pack up and leave, so that not even your spirit is left here." The words flew out of my mouth like arrows, and each one hit her more painfully than the last. She fell to her knees, her arms stretched out to me, as if she wanted to hold me, begging for forgiveness. Her face was wet with tears, and her voice was breaking with sobs. "Thomas, I'm begging you, listen to me. I don't know how this happened. Please give me a chance." But I could no longer hear her words. They no longer had any meaning for me. Her attempts to justify herself sounded hollow, like an echo echoing off the walls that had witnessed her betrayal. There was no more pity or sympathy in my eyes. I came closer, grabbed her by the collar and lifted her off the floor. She looked exhausted, broken, but even at that moment I could not find a single drop of compassion in myself. Gritting my teeth, I pushed her against the door, feeling her shaking with fear and despair. "Your time is up," I repeated quietly but firmly, and pushed her over the threshold with force. She fell to the floor, stumbling like a doll out of control. The blanket fell from her shoulders, revealing her wounded soul and humiliated body. I stood in the doorway, watching her lie in front of me, hunched over and crying, silently begging me to bring her back. The neighbors who were leaving their houses in the morning stopped and looked at us. Some of them wanted to come over, others tried to pretend they didn't see anything. I heard someone whispering, maybe we should call the police, but no one dared to intervene. They knew what had happened in my house and didn't dare to come any closer. "Tomas, please," she cried, reaching for the door. Her voice sounded desperate, but I didn't listen anymore. I closed the door again, hearing her whisper one last time, "I have nowhere to go." My world seemed empty. The feeling of emptiness gradually filled the space, replacing anger with cold calm. I went to the phone and dialed the number of my supervisor. The voice that answered was concerned. "Thomas, what happened? You were supposed to be on a flight." "I need to take a few days off." "It's a personal matter," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He said something about the importance of flights, but I wasn't listening. All that mattered was deciding what to do next. I put the phone down, looked at the door, and heard her muffled sobs coming from outside. She was still sitting there, under the door, crying and begging me to let her back in. My gaze turned cold, and I walked to the door, slowly closing it, separating myself from her cries. That night was the end of something important, but also the beginning of a new chapter in which she no longer had a place. The next day I went to the lawyer and filed for divorce. His office was quiet and austere, and he listened to me, taking careful note of every word. "Are you sure, Thomas?" he asked when I finished telling my story. "Absolutely," I answered, and my voice sounded confident, without a shadow of doubt. The decision was made. The next step was to put the house on the market. This place where we were supposed to build our happy life could no longer be my home. After I filed for divorce and put the house up for sale, my emotions found no outlet. It seemed like the whole world had collapsed on me and left me alone with this emptiness and anger that was hard to describe in words. That evening I decided to call a few friends. I needed company, support, and perhaps a way to release the anger that had been building up inside. We agreed to meet at a local pub where we used to get together to celebrate successes or just relax after a hard day. The pub was filled with noise, laughter, and the smell of freshly poured beer. People were talking, joking, as if nothing could break their mood. But for me, this atmosphere was empty. I was sitting at a table with my friends, listening to their conversations with the corner of my ear. They tried to cheer me up, joked around, but I couldn't focus on anything but my pain. Each sip of beer only fueled my anger, made it sharper. The tension inside me grew like an avalanche, ready to come down. "Thomas, why don't you forget about it for a while? At least for the evening," one of my friends said, hinting that I needed to take my mind off it. I looked at him and was at a loss for words. I could feel my eyes filling with tears, and I couldn't hold it back. The first tears flowed, and I leaned forward, hiding my face in my hands. It was like a dam breaking. I was sitting in a noisy pub, surrounded by people, but feeling as alone as I had ever felt before. My friends were silent, giving me the opportunity to cry. At that moment, I realized that the pain was so deep that no amount of talking or joking could wash it away. After a few minutes of silence, I got up and went to the bar to order another beer. The bartender looked at me with sympathy, but said nothing, just poured me another glass. I felt the alcohol spreading through my body, dulling the pain and clouding my mind. Soon, a couple of men approached the next table, talking loudly and seemingly laughing at something stupid. Their voices became a harsh background for my thoughts, and suddenly I wanted them to stop talking. One of them, noticing my gaze, threw a joke that struck a chord with me. I felt my fists clenching again, and the anger that had been hidden a minute ago burst out. "You got a problem, buddy?" one of them asked, leaning closer. His eyes glittered with an insolence I couldn't stand right now. "Fuck you," I started, but before I could finish, I felt my friends grabbing my shoulders, trying to keep me from getting into a fight. Their voices mingled with the noise of the pub, but all I could hear was my anger and the pounding of my own heart. "Thomas, stop it, it's not worth it," one of them whispered in my ear. His words immediately brought me back to reality. I pulled away and sat back, feeling my anger gradually give way to shame and fatigue. We left the pub late at night, when the city was already asleep and the dark streets were lit only by lanterns. My friends silently followed me with their eyes, realizing that words would not help now. The next morning I was woken up by a phone call. Amelia's name was on the screen. The feeling of pain and betrayal returned with renewed vigor. I picked up the phone but was silent, not knowing what to say. "Thomas, please don't do this. I know I made a mistake. I will change, I will fix myself. You are important to me. Give me another chance." Her voice was trembling and I could hear her crying. Every word she said stuck with me, reminding me of the moments when we were happy. But I also remembered everything I had seen and heard that night. I was silent, listening to her plea. My heart was clenching, but the anger and pain were stronger. Instead of answering, I just pressed the end button. Before turning off the phone, I said only one thing: "Don't call here again." After the house was sold, I felt that I had lost a part of myself along with its walls. This place that we had created with the hope of a happy future was now just a memory, burdened with pain and bitterness. I packed my things, threw them in the trunk of my car, and set off on my flight, hoping that the road would help drown out what was eating me from the inside. The road has always been a place of calm for me, where I could collect my thoughts and feel free from everything that was left behind. But this time everything was different. Every kilometer, every meter of the road that I covered seemed heavy, as if the burden of the past was hanging on me and did not allow me to let go of the memories. There was a constant pain in my chest that squeezed my heart and prevented me from taking a full breath. It was not physical pain, but a deep wound that I carried with me like an invisible cross. The voice in my head did not stop, even when I tried not to think about the past. It asked me over and over again, did I do the right thing? Maybe I made a decision too quickly? Maybe I should have listened to her, given her a chance to explain herself? But every time I got to that thought, the image of that night, her laughter and the looks of the other men in our house would reappear before my eyes, destroying any attempts to find an excuse. Flight after flight, I tried to escape from the pain, from the thoughts that were gnawing at me from the inside. My hands held the steering wheel, my eyes looked at the road, but in my heart I felt like a prisoner. I no longer belonged to myself or to this world. Anger and resentment became my companions, and I could not get rid of them. The feeling of injustice ignited a fire inside me that demanded an outlet. My memory painted scenes of revenge. I imagined finding each of those who had been in my house that night. Looking into their eyes, asking them if they knew what they had destroyed. I thought about how each of them would have heard me say words that would have shattered their peace, how their smiles would have disappeared, replaced by fear and understanding. I imagined these scenes with such realism that I could almost taste revenge on my tongue. But then I would be filled with emptiness and realize that it would not heal my wounds. Revenge would not bring back what I had lost, would not restore my heart. I kept thinking that maybe I should have listened to Amelia. Maybe she had an explanation that I didn't want to hear at that moment. But would that excuse have been strong enough to convince me? My thoughts were contradictory, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like a prisoner of my own mind. Months passed, and I remained in this circle of hopelessness. The only way to find at least temporary peace was in the bottle. Alcohol became my refuge, a temporary shelter from the pain. I would stop at gas stations where I would buy not only fuel but also a bottle of cheap booze, which I would hide in the glove compartment. In the evenings, after a long day of driving, would sit on the edge of my bunk in the cab and open the bottle. The first sip burned my throat, but after a moment it brought a sweet oblivion, albeit a short one. Instead of pain, indifference came, albeit briefly. Alcohol clouded my mind, and in moments when I was drunk, thoughts of revenge seemed even more attractive. I dreamed of finding them all and asking them how they felt that night, if they ever thought about the fact that they had destroyed someone else's world. But in the morning, when the alcohol wore off, all that was left was bitterness and brokenness. After months that turned into endless days of anger, despair, and alcohol, I realized that I couldn't go on like this. The road, which had once been a symbol of freedom and peace for me, had become a trap that only intensified my inner torment. Night stops, when I sat in the darkness of the cab and drank to forget for a moment, no longer brought relief. The emptiness was getting deeper and deeper, and I realized that I couldn't get out of it on my own. One day, during a flight, I accidentally heard a story on the radio about a man who was telling how he managed to recover from a painful breakup. He talked about how he sought help and eventually found a way out with the help of a psychologist. These words stuck in my head. I hesitated for a long time, wondering if I should take this step or if it would be another failure. But in the end, I decided that I had nothing to lose. When I returned from my next flight, I found the contacts of the psychologist I had heard about on the radio program. His office was small but cozy, with warm colors and a large window that let in light. He invited me to sit down and started with simple questions that seemed to be unimportant, but gradually brought to the surface the deep emotions I had been hiding so carefully. At first, I was reluctant to talk, but with each session I told more, and in the process I felt something changing inside me. The psychologist, calm and attentive, did not jump to conclusions and did not try to convince me of the rightness or wrongness of my actions. He just listened and pushed me to think, to come to certain conclusions on my own. During one of our sessions, he pulled a book off the shelf, the title of which confused me a bit, How to Get Back on Your Feet in 30 Days After Cheating. I looked at him skeptically, not hiding my doubts. The book seemed to me to be just another one of those boilerplate guides that abound on bookshelves. I was about to refuse, but he said, "This book won't give you all the answers, but it can be an impetus to start moving forward. Try to start with it." I took the book home and left it on my desk without touching it for a few days. My skepticism didn't disappear, but every day I saw its cover, something inside me pushed me to try it. One evening, when it was hard to sleep, I opened the first page. The words written by the author struck me with their simplicity and depth at the same time. He talked about pain, about betrayal, about how difficult it is to trust again and move on. Each chapter was like a conversation with a friend who had gone through the same thing. Over time, I started to read further, and at the same time, something in me began to change. I was no longer looking for answers only in my anger. I started thinking about how to become stronger, how to free myself from this heaviness. Each page of the book opened up a new angle of view for me, helped me realize that revenge or alcohol could not fill the void left by betrayal. The psychologist supported me by asking me about my impressions of the book, and we discussed what I was reading. He explained that the process of recovery is never easy and never straightforward, but every small step is important. After a few months of working with a psychologist and reading a book that gradually changed my attitude to life, I realized that it was time to stop and look at myself from a different perspective. My days, which used to be filled with alcohol and thoughts of revenge, gradually began to take on new colors. The first thing I decided to do was to stop drinking. Alcohol, which once seemed to be the only escape from pain, became a symbol of my decline. Giving it up was the first step on the way to rebuilding myself as a person. Every day was a struggle. The morning hours, when I used to feel very tired and empty, now became a time to plan my future. I started to take care of myself, going to the gym, running in the morning, doing exercises that helped strengthen not only my body but also my spirit. Physical activity brought not only relief but also a new purpose. With each session, I felt myself getting stronger and regaining the confidence I had lost. Once, during a regular session, the psychologist told me that a change of scenery can help turn the page of the past. This idea stuck with me. My old house, where the worst moments of my life happened, was now just a monument to pain. I decided to sell it and move to another city where I could start from scratch. This decision was not easy, but it was necessary. I packed my things, left what had once been our fortress, and moved towards a new life. The new city greeted me in a completely different way. It was full of energy, people who were in a hurry to live their lives, laughing carefree in the streets and working towards their goals. I started building my dream house, a place that would become my new refuge, where no shadow of the past could find me. The work on the house captured me completely. I developed the plan myself, chose the materials, and even took part in some of the work myself. Every nail, every board became a part of my recovery, a symbol that I can create something new and beautiful, regardless of the past. It was hard, sometimes the thoughts of what was left behind came back, but I knew how to deal with them. Reading the book, How to Get Back on Your Feet in 30 Days After Cheating, made me realize that recovery does not happen instantly, but every small victory is important. The book helped me to realize that it was time to focus not on those who hurt me, but on myself, on being the best version of myself. I was grateful to it for several key moments that became a turning point in my life. First, the book taught me how to forgive. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation with someone who betrayed you. It means letting go of the anger that eats you up inside and freeing your heart for new feelings. Instead of letting anger control me, I learned to accept the past as a lesson. It didn't make me weaker, on the contrary, I felt stronger and more in control. Second, I learned the importance of self-respect. Often, after an affair, people feel inferior and lose self-confidence. The book reminded me that my value does not depend on the actions of other people. Every day I reminded myself that I deserved better, that I had the right to be happy. This thought helped me get up in the morning and continue to build my life. Third, the book taught me how to set new goals. Instead of focusing on revenge or feeling sorry for myself, I started thinking about what I wanted to do for myself. One of those goals was to create my new home, and then to create new relationships that I would build on trust and respect. A few years have passed since my life was turned upside down. I learned how to build a new reality, to get back on my feet after the most difficult test in my life. Today, I look in the mirror and see a man who has been through fire and water, who not only survived, but learned to breathe again. My days are filled with work, sports, and traveling, which previously seemed unattainable. I know how to appreciate the moments of peace that fill my new home, and I am proud to have created it from scratch. However, there is one thing that still haunts me: trust. The betrayal I experienced left a deep scar in my heart. Every attempt to start a new relationship ended in failure. I felt that I could not trust women the way I used to. Even the most sincere smiles and kind words made me doubt and suspect. It became a barrier that I could not overcome. No psychologist could give me the key to regaining my ability to trust. I spent every new day fighting these fears. I could control my emotions, be independent and strong, but as soon as it came to trust, everything became more difficult. I knew this would stay with me for a long time, maybe even forever. There were no more naive dreams that love is always faithful and pure. This part of my heart was broken, and no amount of talking or therapy could glue it back together. The residue from the past remained, and I felt it every day. It wasn't an open wound, but it reminded me of myself with a scar that would shrink when I saw couples in love on the streets or heard friends' stories about their relationships. Surviving a betrayal and seeing it with your own eyes is an experience that changes you forever. It teaches you caution, which becomes a part of your essence. With that, I want to thank everyone who listened to my story. It has not been easy, and I know that for some, it can be a mirror of their own pain. But I also believe that even in the darkest of times, you can find a way to the light. Trusting again is hard, and perhaps the biggest challenge I have yet to overcome. But I am working on it, and I know that life always has unexpected twists and turns. I want to reach out to all of you. If you liked my story or if it touched you, please leave a comment. What would you do in my place? Would you condemn my choice or perhaps support it? I am interested in hearing your thoughts, your stories, and your experiences. Let's create a space for honest dialogue together. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. This will help me create more content like this and share my stories with you. And remember that even in the darkest moments, we can find light if we are not afraid to look for it. I apologize for any mistakes in the text. I am still learning and improving. Thank you for your support and for being with me.